Chapter 5 of the book of This and That, The Humors of Murder. Almost everyone who has committed a murder knows that the business has its tragic side. Whether it also has its comic side is a question that has been raised since the production of Sir James Barrie's play, The Adored One. This, as most people are aware, is a farce about a lady who kills a man by pushing him out of a railway carriage because he will not allow the window to be shut. Some of the critics have protested that the theme is too grim for light entertainment. They are, most of them, probably lovers of fresh air who foresee a new danger in railway travel if women, creatures already enjoying the possession of an extremely feeble moral sense, are taught to regard the murder of a hygienic fellow passenger as a laughing matter. Some years ago, when the playboy of the Western world was first put on the stage in Dublin, there were similar denunciations of the idea of making a comedy of murder. It was then considered, however, that nobody outside Ireland could take murder so seriously as to miss seeing the joke of it. As a matter of fact, I believe the average respectable man all the world over would side in his heart with the Dublin demonstrators. Murder is, after all, one of the oldest institutions on earth. It dates from the second generation of the human race. It is almost as venerable as a sin can be, and to treat it flippantly is as shocking to comfortable ears as the blasphemies of a boy. Everybody knows how Baudelaire used to shock the citizens of Brussels by opening his conversations in cafes in a raised voice with the words, "The night I killed my father." He has himself related how he began the thing as a joke in order to punish the Belgians for believing everything he said. "Exasperated by always being believed," he wrote, "I spread the report that I had killed my father, and that I had eaten him, and that, if I had been allowed to escape from France, it was only on account of the services I had rendered to the French police. And I was believed." This is the penalty of the jester on serious subjects like murder. He is nearly always believed. The very mention of prepense death puts a great many people into a solemn mood that is hostile to wit and humor and any kind of facetiousness. I have met men and women, for instance, who were quite unable to see the entertaining side of cannibalism. Gilbert's ballad of the Nancy Lee, about the cook who gradually ate all the rest of the crew, moves them not to laughter but to horror. When the cook, or somebody else, as he gobbles one of his mates, enthusiastically exclaims, "Oh, how like pig!" they merely shudder. Those of us who are amused, on the other hand, are so only because we are not such inveterate realists as our neighbours. We treat comic murders as Charles Lamb treated comic cuckoldries. We regard them as happening, not in our world of realities, but in a kind of no-man's land of humour. If it were not so, we should probably be as shocked as anyone else. Those of us, that is, who are old-fashioned enough to consider murder and adultery as on the whole reprehensible. Luckily, human beings in the mass have gradually developed an artistic sense which enables them to leave the world of serious facts for the world of comic pretenses at a moment's notice. And even the strictest humanitarian can smile with a good conscience at the most hideous of the tortures, something with boiling oil in it, discussed in the paper fan world of the Mikado. I can imagine a sensitive child's being sharply disturbed by the punishments that at one time seemed to be in store for so many of the characters in the opera, but for the rest of us Gilbert's Japan is as unreal as a nest of insects, where even the crimes seem funny. In the same way, we have made a child's joke of Bluebeard, whose prototype was at least as atrocious a character as Jack the Ripper. Perhaps in some distant island of the South Seas, where Europe is sufficiently remote to be unreal, the children are already enjoying the humours of Jack the Ripper in the local substitute for the Christmas pantomime. Even a real murder, however, may strike one as amusing, if only it has about it something incongruous. 1,000 people have laughed for one who has wept over Wainwright's murder of Helen Abercrombie, not because it was not a filthy deed, but because the murderer, on being reproached for it, uttered his famous reply, "Yes, it was a dreadful thing to do, but she had very thick ankles." Here it is the incongruity between the deed and the excuse for it that appeals to our sense of humour. We laugh at it as we would laugh at Milton's Satan if we saw him dressed in baby clothes. Similarly, when Peer Gynt and the cook fight after the shipwreck for possession of the place of safety on the upturned boat, and Peer in effect murders the cook, the situation is comic because of the incongruity between what is said and what is done. Take, for instance, the Lord's Prayer scene. The cook, slipping. "I'm drowning." Peer, seizing him. "By this wisp of hair I'll hold you. Say your Lord's Prayer, quick." The cook. "I can't remember. All turns black." Peer. "Come, the essentials in a word." The cook. "Give us this day." Peer. "Skip that part, cook. You'll get all you need safe enough." The cook. "Give us this day." Peer. "The same old song. 'Tis plain you were a cook in life." The cook slips from his grasp. The cook, sinking. "Give us this day our..." Disappears. Peer. "Amen, lad. To the last gasp you were yourself." Draws himself up on to the bottom of the boat. "So long as there is life, there's hope." It is the paradox that delights us here, the exquisite inappropriateness of Peer's invitation to the cook to say a prayer before he lets him dip under for the last time, and of the only petition which the cook can remember in his extremity. The latter amuses us, like Mr. George Moore's story about the Irish poet, who was asked to say a prayer when out in a curragh on Galway Bay during a furious gale, and who astonished the boat's crew by beginning, "Of man's first disobedience and the fruit." Even in the Playboy, it is the humours of the inappropriate that make Christy Mahan's narrative of how he slew his da comic. One remembers the sentence in which he first lets the secret of his deed slip out. Christy. "Don't strike me. I killed me poor father. Tuesday was a week for doing the like of that." Pegeen, in blank amazement. "Has I killed your father?" Christy, subsiding. "With the help of God I did, surely, and that the Holy Immaculate Mother may intercede for his soul." There you have incongruity to a point that shocks an ordinary Christian like a blasphemy. And Christy's reflection, as he finds that the supposed murder has made him a hero, "I'm thinking this night, wasn't I a foolish fella not to kill my father in the years gone by?" tickles us because it brings a new and incongruous standard to the measurement of moral values. De Quincey's essay, on murder considered as one of the fine arts, owes its reputation for humour to the same kind of unexpectedness in its table of values. At least, that passage in which the lecturer of the essay describes the warning he gave to a new servant whom he suspected of dabbling in murder plays a delightful topsy-turvy game with our everyday moral world. If once a man indulges himself in murder, very soon he comes to think very little of robbing, and from robbing he comes next to drinking and Sabbath breaking, and from that to incivility and procrastination. Once begin upon this downward path, you never know where you are to stop. Many a man has dated his ruin from some murder or other that perhaps he thought little of at the time. Humor is largely a matter of new proportions and unexpected elements, and it visits the jail as readily as the music hall, and attends us in our hearse no less than in our perambulator. Self-murder is not in itself a funny subject, but who can remain solemn over the case of the man who put an end to his life because he got tired of all the buttoning and unbuttoning? Similarly, detestable a crime as we may think cannibalism, we cannot help smiling when a traveler notes, as a recent traveler in West Africa did, that human flesh never gives the eater indigestion as the flesh of beasts does. It is, at least I suppose it is, merely a statement of fact, but it amuses us because it introduces an inappropriate and unexpected element into our consideration of cannibalism. Perhaps Sir James Barrie would prefer to defend the humor of the adored one on the ground not that it is the humor of unreality, but that, like the examples I have quoted, it is the humor of incongruity. And indeed, we only laugh at Leonora's murder in the train because the reason for it was so disproportionate to the crime. It is not funny for a woman to kill a man because he has beaten her black and blue. It is not funny for her to kill him for his money, or for any other reasonable motive. On the other hand, it would be funny if she killed him for smoking a pipe while wearing a tall hat, or because he said lay instead of lie. It is the unreason of the thing that appeals to us, and no amount of theorizing about the immorality of murder can deprive us of our joke. At the same time, one is willing to admit the excellence of those people who are so overwhelmed by the exceeding sinfulness of sin that they cannot raise a smile over even the most ridiculous scenes of murder and marital infidelity. I know a great many people who can see nothing comic in the upside-down antics of the drunken. They feel as if in laughing at the absurdities of vice, they would be acquiescing in vice. Perhaps they would. Perhaps laughter is given to sinners as a compensation for sins. It makes us tolerant by making us cheerful. And if we could really laugh at murders and all indecencies, we should possibly end in thinking that they are far less black than they are painted. So, I imagine, the unlaughing saints reason. They always visualize sin in its horror in a way that is beyond most of us, and we can respect their gloom. But we who are more complex than the saints, we know well enough that so paradoxical an affair is the human soul that a man may laugh and keep the 10 Commandments, and we claim the right, on the plea that my mind to me a kingdom is, of maintaining a court fool in our hearts to parody our royal existence, and so keep it from going stale. In any case, we can no more help laughing than we can help the color of our hair. That is why we shall go on laughing at the humors of the 7 deadly sins, and why old scoundrels like Nero and Gilles de Rais and Henry VIII are likely to remain favorite characters in the comic chapters of human life till the book is burnt and a new volume opens. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6. The Decline and Fall of Hell. It is significant of the change that has come over the religious imagination that a number of representative clergymen have issued a manifesto of disbelief in hell, and no heresy hunt has begun. Disbelief in hell, it must in fairness be added, not as a symbol of something sufficiently real, but as a definite place on the map of the universe, a gulf of wild flame and red-hot torments without end. There was a time when to doubt any jot or tittle in the scenery and rhetoric of hell would have been thought a kind of atheism, and a world without hell would have seemed to many religious minds almost as lonely as a world without God. Life was conceived chiefly in terms of hell. It was a kind of tightrope walk across a bottomless pit of shooting fires and the intolerable wailing of the damned. Heaven was sought less almost for its proper delights than as an escape from the malignance of the demons in this vast torture chamber. Hell, indeed, was the most desperately real of countries. For centuries man studied its geography with greater zeal of research than we devote today to the geography of Africa. They described its rule and estimated its population, one author, with how much belief I know not, detailing the names of 72 of its princes, with 7,405,926 devils serving them. In the Apocalypse of St. Peter, which is as old at least as the 2nd century, the occupations of the damned are set forth with horrid carefulness. Hell is depicted as a continent of lakes of fire and burning mud, over which adulterers hang by the hair and blasphemers of the way of righteousness by the tongue. False witnesses chew tongues of fire in their mouths. Misers roll on red-hot stones sharper than spikes. Men who have committed unnatural crimes are endlessly hurled from the top of dreadful crags, and this is but one of the first of a long line of visions of the hereafter which appeared, like the season's fruits, all through the early Christian centuries in the Middle Ages, and achieved their perfect statement in Dante. Every new writer sought out the most exquisite torment a sensational imagination could invent, and added them to the picture of the daily life of hell and purgatory. The monk of Evesham saw in his dreams of purgatory men being fried in a pan, and others pierced with fiery nails even to their bones and to the loosening of their joints. Others were gnawed by worms, or dragged with hooks, or hung on gallows, or soaked in baths of pitch and brimstone with a horrible stench. And if they tried to escape, the devils that met with them beat them sorely with scourges and forks and other kinds of torments. But we need not go back beyond our own days for instances of these torturing imaginations. Many who are now living have had the night fears of their childhood made monstrous with stories of devils with red-hot pincers to tear one's flesh and with red-hot nails to lacerate one's back. I have a friend who loves to tell of the regular Sunday summons of an ancient clergyman to his congregation to flee from the doom of the condemned sinner, whom he invariably pictured as seated upon a projecting crag over a lurid, hissing, moaning, raging sea of an undone eternity, calling out, "The harvest is past and I am not saved." Why the human imagination did not revolt against such a painful orgy of sensationalism long before it did, it is difficult to understand. Lecky tells us that the only prominent theologian to dispute the material fire of hell throughout the Middle Ages was the Irishman Johannes Scotus Erigena. All the others accepted it in either terror or with delight. For who can question that men can obtain as fiercely sensual a pleasure from inflicting the pains of hell on their enemies as from flogging children and slaves? One of the best known instances of this, shall I say hellish, sensualism is the appeal of Tertullian to his fellow Christians not to attend public spectacles on the ground that they would one day behold the far more glorious spectacle of the heathen rolling in the flames of the pit. "What," he wrote, "shall be the magnitude of that scene? How shall I wonder? How shall I laugh? How shall I rejoice? How shall I triumph when I behold so many and such illustrious kings, who are said to be mounted into heaven groaning with Jupiter their god in the lowest darkness of hell? Then shall the soldiers who persecuted the name of Christ burn in more cruel fire than any they had kindled for the saints." Compared with such spectacles, with such subjects of triumph as these, what can praetor or consul, quaestor or pontiff afford? And even now faith can bring them near. Imagination can depict them as present. Thus hell became the poor man's consolation, the oppressed and baited man's revenge. Sleep itself hardly brought greater balm than the thought of this large engulfing doom for opprobrious neighbors. It would be unfair, on the other hand, to suggest that the ordinary Christian ever believed in hell save in honesty of misery of heart. "O Lord," an old lay evangelist used to pray in the homes he visited, "shake these, thy children, over hellfire, but shake them in mercy." There you have the voice of one who regarded hell not with glee as the end of his enemies, but with desperate earnestness as a necessary moral agency, who believed that men must be terrorized into virtue, or never know virtue at all. And it is interesting to note, a clerical correspondent has been writing to the Daily News, expressing the same gloomy view. This writer declares, as the fruit of long experience, that he has never known a case of man's being converted except through fear. It is common enough, too, or used to be, to hear church-going young men profess that if they did not believe in hell, they would amaze the earth with their lusts and exploits. Viewed in this light, the devil becomes the world's super-policeman, and those who seek to abolish him will naturally be looked on as dangerous anarchists who would destroy the foundations of law. As for that, it would be foolish to deny the great part played by fear in the lives both of sinners and saints. But whether morality is ultimately served by our being afraid of the wrong things is a question that calls for consideration. Certainly, hell has produced its crop of devils as well as of saints upon earth. It was men who believed in hell who invented the thumbscrew and the rack and many of the most fiendish instruments of torture the world has known. Whether it is the case that man made hell because he believed in torture, or took to torture because he believed in hell, there is no denying that the worst period of torture our European civilization has known coincided with the time when men believed that God himself doomed to savage and eternal torments men, women, and even infants in the cradle on the most paltry excuses. And as men's conscience has more and more decisively forbidden him to use torture as a punishment, it has also forbidden him to believe that a beneficent deity could do such a thing. It may be thought that a beneficent deity would permit cancer and the Putumayo and the factory system at its worst might easily enough sanction the fires of the medieval hell. But even cancer and the Putumayo are not a denial of what Stevenson called the ultimate decency of things. They are temporary, not eternal. Thoughtful Christians can no longer accept the old hell because it would mean not the final triumph of righteousness, but the final defeat of God. Many of those who dutifully cling to the dogma of their church on the point would agree with the French curé who said that he believed in hell, but he did not think there was anybody in it except Voltaire. And even Voltaire will nowadays seem to most people to be hardly a sufficiently scandalous person to deserve infinite millions of years of anguish. The truth is, hell shocks our moral sense. Tennyson put the modern disbelief in it with the theoretical forcibleness when he said that if after death he woke up, even though it should be in heaven, and found there was a hell, he would turn round and shake his fist in the face of God Almighty. Since Tennyson's time, hell's foundations have subsided, the ancient flames have died down, and man has now for the background of his days no fierce and devouring universe, but a cricket scoreboard and a page of thinklet competitions in a penny paper. Perhaps the antithesis is an unfair one, but some cosmic sense has certainly been lost to the general imagination. No doubt it will return as moral ideas take the place of materialistic terrors, for out of the wreck of the fiery hell a moral hell is already rising. A moral purgatory, one ought to say. A place of discipline, made in the image of this disciplining earth. For the terrors of death and evil and pain all survive, and if we abolish utterly the devil with the pitchfork, and put in his place the button moulder, is that a figure a pennyworth less dreadful? No, the escape from hell is not so much a holiday as we thought. There is still an interval of adventure between us and paradise, and all the perils and fears to be overcome as of old. We have chased an allegory from our doors, but its ghostly reality returns and stands outside the window. And salvation and damnation remain the two chief facts under the sun, and the saints and the parsons, and everybody, indeed except gloating old Tertullian, were right after all. End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7. On Cheerful Readers. There has been an increasing demand lately for cheerful books. Mr. Balfour began it, at least he gave it a voice by quoting approvingly a phrase from one of Mr. Bennet's novels about the books that cheer us all up. It was a most unfortunate phrase to quote in public. It confirmed every bald old scaramouche in all his hostilities to realism, tragedy, and every other form of literature that does not go about with its hat over its eye. It also confirmed a popular prejudice to the effect that it is the duty of men of letters to be cheerful in a way in which it is not the duty, say, of mathematicians to be cheerful. Now, one need not be an enemy of cheerfulness to detest this theory. One merely needs to be sufficiently awake to recognize that cheerfulness may easily become a tyranny which will bind the hands and feet of literature as it has already bound the hands and feet of drama. Cheerfulness, cheerfulness, and yet again cheerfulness is the all too golden rule in the theatre. One result of this is that Ibsen has been expelled from the stage for the only naughtiness of which the English theatre takes notice, the naughtiness of being serious. Even Mr. Shaw, who possesses the comic spirit in greater abundance than any other writer of his time, is flayed alive by the critics on the production of each new play he writes, because, besides being cheerful, he is a man of ideas. It is not enough that you should be cheerful. You must be cheerful to the exclusion of everything else, everything at least that might bring unrest to the intellect or the spirit, or to any other part of a man except the muscles that work the oil wells of sentiment and the creaking jaws of laughter. The consequences might have been foreseen. No one, unaided, could be quite so inhumanly vacuous as the audiences in the theatres expected him to be. And so the dramatic author had to call in to his aid the musicians, the poets, the limelight men, the mask sellers, the dancing girls, the dressmakers, and a host of other people, each of whom separately could only be a little inane, but all of whom together could be overwhelmingly inane, and among them they produced that overwhelming inanity, musical comedy. There you have the ultimate logic of cheerfulness in the theatre. It is like the obtrusive cheerfulness of the performing animals in music halls. It is a tedious and beastly thing. It is cheerfulness without mind or meaning. It is like a laugh painted on a clown's face. Compulsory cheerfulness must always end like that, because, if one has to laugh all the time, it is far easier to put the laugh on with a brush than to keep one's face distorted by strength of will. With the warning of the cheerful theatre before us, then, it would be the stupidest folly to pay any heed to the new plea for cheerful books. It is an extraordinary fact that thousands of people can be serious to the point of bad temper over a political argument or a game of cards or tennis, but if you asked them to take a book seriously, they would regard the prospect as worse than a dry pharyngitis. They put literature on a level not with their games, but with the chocolates and drinks they consume when they are resting from their games. It is of the chocolate kind of literature that 99 out of 100 persons are thinking when they applaud phrases about the books that cheer us all up. Or it might be nearer the mark to liken the sort of literature they have in mind to one of those brands of medicated port which innocent old ladies find grateful and comforting. We live in an age of advertised brain fag, and we demand of literature that it shall be the literature of brain fag. We ask of it not friendship, but a drug. That is the heresy which must be killed if letters are to live. Till it is killed, they will not even be enjoyed. I grant at once that it would be an impudence to expect an average sensual man to regard books with the same profound interest as his business affairs, or his wife. On the other hand, persuade him that it is pleasant to put as much of his heart into the enjoyment of a book as he puts into the enjoyment of a football match, and you will produce a revolution among the book-reading public. No man who is not eccentric dreams of asking that a football match shall be amusing or a game of chess cheerful. He goes to the one for its furious energy, for the thrill of the rivalry of real people. He turns to the other for an experience of intensity, of prescient skill. It is for energetic experiences of a comparable kind, as Mr. R. A. Scott James suggestively pointed out in a recent volume, that we go to literature. Literature is not primarily meant to cheer us up when we are too tired to read the paper, although incidentally it often does so, and to despise this kind of literature would be as sinful as to despise Christmas pudding and brandy sauce. But the purpose of literature is not to be an epilogue to energy. It involves not a slackening, but a change of effort. That is why even the difficult authors, like the Browning of Sordello, attract us. They have the appeal of pathless mountains. It is a curious fact, at the same time, that some of those who delight most boldly in physical experiences turn from intellectual and imaginative experiences with a kind of contempt. They despise from their hearts the mollycoddle who will not risk a wound or a cold for the pleasures of the sun and air. But, so far as the imagination is concerned, they themselves are mollycoddles who will not venture beyond a game of halma or a sugar stick by the hearth. What the world of literature needs most is not cheerful writers, but adventurous readers. The reading of poetry will become as popular as swimming once it is recognized that it is as natural and as exhilarating. Literature thus justifies itself not so much by cheering us all up when we are limp, as by its appeal to the spirit of adventure, or, if you like the phrase better, the spirit of experience. That is the explanation of the pleasure we take in tragic literature. Tragedy reminds certain spiritual energies in us that they are alive. It enables them to expand, to exert themselves, to breathe freely. That is why, in literature, it makes us happy to be miserable. To put forth our strength, whether of limb or of imagination, makes for our happiness far more than the passive cheerfulness of the fireside. or if not more, at least as much. It would be ungrateful to speak slightingly of the easy chair and its pleasures, but the chief danger in literature, at present, is not that the easy chair will be neglected, but that it will be given a place of far too great importance. Hence, it is necessary to emphasize the pleasures of the strenuous life in contrast. This may seem to some readers a tolerable excuse for liking tragedy and poetry, but a poor defense of the taste for realism, naturalism, or whatever you like to call it. Even those who respond immediately to the appeal of the mountains and the sea will often resist the invitation of Zola and Huysmans and their followers to seek adventures in the slums. They will not see that it is as natural to go on one's travels in the slums as in the most beautiful lakeland on earth. As a matter of fact, the discovery of the slums was one of the most tremendous discoveries of the 19th century. It was one of those revolutionary discoveries that have changed our whole view of society. Whether it was the men of letters or the sociologists who first discovered them, I do not know. I contend, however, that the men of letters had as much right to go to them as the sociologists. They found life expressed there in horror and beauty, in sordidness and nobility, and to reveal this in literature was to some extent to create a new world for the imagination. It was to do more than this. Society could not become fully self-conscious or articulate until the pauper aspect of it was expressed in literature. Hence, the novelist of mean streets extended the boundaries of social self-consciousness. The realists indeed have brought the remedial imagination to us as the sociologist has brought the remedial facts and figures. This remedialism, no doubt, is an extra-literary interest, but nothing is quite alien to literature which touches the imagination. The imagination may find its treasures in Tyre and Sidon, or in an alley off a back street, or even in a semi-detached villa. One must not limit it in its wanderings to safe and clean and comfortable places. This seems to me to be the great justification of the demand, not for cheerful books, but for cheerful and courageous readers. The cheerful reader will be able to go to hell with Dante and to hospital with Esther Waters, and though this may be but a poor and second-hand courage, it is at least preferable to the intellectual and imaginative cowardice which will admit danger into literature only when it has been stripped of every semblance of reality. The courage of the study, it may be, is not so fine a thing as the courage of the workshop and the field, but it is finer than is generally admitted. And it is much rarer. There is no place in which men and women are so shamelessly lazy and timid as among their books. If happiness lay in that direction, the laziness might be justified. But it does not. Happiness can never come from the atrophy of 9/10 of our nature. It is the result of the vigorous delight of heart and mind and spirit as well as of body. The cheerful reader feels as ready for Aeschylus and his furies as the yachtsman for his sail on a choppy sea. He fears the tragic satire of Madame Bovary no more than a good pedestrian fears the east wind. This is not to say that he does not enjoy cheerful books when he finds them. He may even prefer Tristram Shandy and the Pickwick Papers to Tolstoy, but he realizes that cheerfulness in a book is a delightful accident, not a necessity of literature. He knows that to be cheerful is his own business, whether he goes with his author into the dark and solitary places or into the sheltered and smiling gardens of the sun. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8. St. GBS and the Bishop. There has been a delightful correspondence going on in the Times about Mademoiselle Gaby Deslys. It owed not a little of its charm, I suspect, to the fact that none of the correspondents had seen Gaby. The Bishop of Kensington had not seen her, Mr. H.B. Irving had not seen her, Mr. Bernard Shaw had not seen her. So they quarrelled furiously over her, as men have always quarrelled over the unseen, and if Aesop had been alive he might have got a fable out of the affair. The Bishop made the mistake at the beginning of calling upon the censor to suppress Gaby. Mr. Shaw, at mention of the censor, immediately saw red, and Gaby of the Lilies presented herself to his inflamed vision as a beautiful damsel who was about to be made a meal of by an ecclesiastical monster. He at once challenged the Bishop to battle, a battle of theories. The Bishop unfortunately had no theory with him. he took his stand upon the law. After the manner of Shylock, he insisted upon his pound of flesh. Mr. Shaw, of course, who bristled with theories, could not stand this. So he gave the bishop his choice of theories, and even put several into his mouth and forced a conflict upon him. And it was a famous victory. But what they fought each other for, I could not well make out. Perhaps Mr. Shaw himself did not quite know, but he made during the fight some weird statements which are well worth examination. One of these was, that in regard to sex, as in regard to religion, it is very difficult to say what is good and what is evil, and more difficult still to suppress the one without suppressing the other. So much is this so, according to Mr. Shaw, that one man seeing a beautiful actress will feel that she has made all common debaucheries impossible to him. Another, seeing the same actress in the same part, will plunge straight into those debaucheries because he has seen her body without seeing her soul. But why choose a beautiful actress for the argument? The matter can only be debated fairly if we take the case of an actress whose lure is not beauty, but some indecency of attitude, gesture, or phrase which is meant to awaken the debauchee, keeping house in the breast of each of us with the ineffectual angel, and which either does this or bores us into the bar. I do not, I may say, refer to Gaby Deslys, whom I too have not seen. I made more than one attempt, but the crush of beauty lovers was too great. It is quite easy to imagine an actress such as I have described. Most of us have, in the course of many hours misspent in music halls, seen her. To say that she may do good as well as harm is the same as saying that an indecent photograph may do good as well as harm. If this is to be the last word on the subject, then there is no logical reason why we should not decorate the walls of elementary schools with indecent photographs instead of maps, and teach the children limericks instead of Lady Clara Vere de Vere and the Wreck of the Hesperus. Mr. Shaw may retort that he would allow any man who did not find indecent photographs and limericks objectionable to have his fill of them, but that he would not allow him to thrust them upon children. But this is to pass a moral judgment. If it is not certain whether the dangers of the sensual parodies of the arts are greater than the dangers of religion, or, say, of geography, there is surely no more reason for preserving the children from one than from the other. Even if we waive this point for the sake of argument, is Mr. Shaw's other position tenable? That if we consider any form of entertainment objectionable, we should show our disapproval not by trying to have it stopped, but simply by staying away from it. Surely even in the music hall performances there is a line to be drawn somewhere. We can no more be sure where good ends and evil begins than we can be sure where light ends and darkness begins. But we all have a good enough notion of when it is dark, and it is not so very difficult to tell when a music hall turn is out of bounds. Some people, it may be granted, run to excess in their sense of propriety. They are as delicate as the lady who, when carving a chicken at table, used to inquire, "Will you have a wing or a limb?" On the other hand, there is an equally large number of people who have no delicacy at all, but who are always ready to greet the obscene with a cheer. Their favorite meal of entertainment is brutality for an entree and sensuality for a sweet. They can even mix their dishes at times, as, many years ago in Paris, when a woman stripped to the waist and with her hands tied behind her back used to get down on her knees and wait for rats to be loosed out of a cage, and kill them one by one with her mouth. Is there no reason for suppressing a show of this kind except that it is rough on rats? I think there is. It deserves suppression because it is what we call, in a vague word, degrading. It is easy enough for a lively imagination to picture as beastly a scene in which there would be no rats present, and which, even if 1,000 youths and maidens were willing to pay night after night to see it, would still be a case for the police. One cannot help feeling that in attacking the bishop in regard to the liberty of music halls, Mr. Shaw has allowed himself to be made angry by the way in which the Church nearly always concentrates on sex when it wishes to make war on sin. Probably he does well to be angry. It is always worth while to denounce the Church for making morality so much an affair of abstinences. On the other hand, the Church and the prophets have realized by a wise instinct that this planet on which we live tends perpetually to become a huge disorderly house, and that the history of the world is largely the history of a struggle for decency. At times, no doubt, the world has also been in danger of being converted into a tyrannous Sabbath school, but that was usually an aftermath of disorder. There is no denying that the average human being finds it far easier to learn to leer than to learn to sing psalms. The fight against the leer is one of the first necessities of civilization. It may be argued that a policeman cannot be sent in pursuit of a leer as he can in search of a pickpocket, and that if he were, he would more probably than not run it to earth in some masterpiece of art or literature. But what about the leer when it has been isolated, when it has no more connection with art or literature than with Esperanto? Mr. Shaw seems to think that even in that case the attempt to suppress it would be a form of persecution. But is it persecution to take action against pickpockets, or against employers who dodge the factory acts, or against the corrupters of children? Surely there are offenses that are capable of being dealt with by magistrates. Only the most innocent optimist can believe that sweating, for instance, can be put an end to by public opinion in the abstract as effectively as it can be stopped by public opinion acting through the police. It is no argument to say that if we suppress certain music hall turns because we dislike them, those who object to the theory of the atonement have an equal right to try to suppress the teaching and preaching of that doctrine. Might not the same argument be used against interference with thieves and forgers, or still more extreme criminals in the pursuit of their livelihood? After all, supposing the Methodists added to the Calvinist and Wesleyan varieties already in existence a new sect of, say, aphrodisiac Methodists, it is quite easy to conceive not only public opinion but the police interfering with it with the approval of the mass of moral and immoral citizens. Similarly, if a sect of particular Baptist thugs made its appearance, its religious complexion would hardly save it from suppression. There might still be half a dozen apostles of religious freedom who would tell you that you could not logically take action against the thugs and the aphrodisiacs without preparing the way for the prohibition of Bible reading and for burning psalm singers at the stake. But common sense knows better. It knows that there are certain things which must be put down, either by public opinion or by the police, if the world is to remain a place into which it is worth a child's while to be born. It knows, too, that the liberty to seek after truth and beauty in one's own way does not necessarily involve the liberty to say or to do whatever beastly thing one pleases, even if thousands of people enjoy it. If it did, then the censor's interference with Mrs. Warren's profession would be an act of the same kind as Scotland Yard's interference with the worst kind of night-clubs. At the same time, one need not deny that the difficulty of deciding what should be suppressed and what should not is immense. I see that in some part of the world or other Isadora Duncan's dancing has been prohibited. I myself have met a lady who, when she was taken to see Madame Duncan, was in an agony of blushes till she got out into the street. But she sat through the Merry Widow without turning a hair. What, then, is to be the test in these matters? On the whole, I think it is a good rule to fight against the suppression of anything that can, by any stretch of the imagination, be considered honestly intended or beautiful. In the arts, one can believe without casuistry. Beauty ultimately transforms the beast. But there are forms of art, literature, and drama which are nothing else than a kind of indecent exposure. Let us give them the benefit of the doubt so long as there is a doubt. But when there is no doubt, let them be given the benefit of the policeman. I wonder whether Mr. Shaw would have argued so fiercely on the other side if the bishop had not dragged in the censor. If the controversy had not got mixed up with the censorship, indeed it would have greatly simplified matters. Mr. Shaw seems to have begun to belabor the bishop from a feeling that a blow to the bishop was a blow to the censor. But having once begun, he seems to have gone on simply because he enjoyed beating a bishop. And of the remains there were gathered up 12 baskets full. But all the same, I cannot help feeling that the bishop perished in a good cause. End of chapter 8.